It's just before dawn on a brisk autumn morning. But employees at the Colorado Springs Sun newspaper are already in high gear.
Oh, I'm sorry. Remember we were going to switch you and Emily up? Thank you.
Manager Renee Wheatley is making the rounds, ensuring everything is running smoothly.
Thanks, guys. Have a good day.
Renee notices an undelivered stack of newspapers near the loading dock. She realizes that one of her employees, a delivery man by the name of Louis Krause, hasn't reported for work.
Louis was a good-sized fella, had a little pot belly. He was a very friendly guy, and he was always very cordial, and you could tell that he was brought up with some good manners.
He was well-liked and well-known by his co-workers. He was just an all-around good person.
As much as Louis fit in with his fellow employees, there was something different about him.
He was described as being somewhat mentally challenged, mentally disabled.
He seemed to have a good positive energy about him, but clearly very slow.
Louis loved his job at the newspaper. It was out of character for him to take a day off without notifying his boss.
You could count on him like you could the sun coming up. And so when he didn't show up, people were very concerned.
Renee Wheatley calls Louis at home, but there's no answer. Eventually, she decides to check in on him.
She went to the house and discovered that his vehicle was parked in the garage.
Louis's car might be there, but Louis himself is nowhere in sight.
She became concerned about his welfare. She contacted the Colorado Springs Police Department.
Minutes later, officers arrive at Louis's residence.
Yes, ma'am.
I'm the one that called. Lewis works for me at the newspaper, and he didn't come in. It's not like him at all.
Okay, stay right here if you don't mind, please. We'll be right back. Thanks.
Searching the home's perimeter, officers can't detect any signs of foul play. At least at first.
Officers began to walk around the residence, and they did observe a basement window that had been taken out of the frame. They were able to look through the window and see a deceased body in the basement level of the house. There was blood on the floor, blood smeared on the walls. At that point, the homicide unit was notified to respond.
Across town, Lt.Joe Kenda is fighting his way through a mountain of paperwork.
Kenda.
When I first got the call, they said, we found a dead body in the house, looks like a homicide. That was the initial information.
All right, be right there. Thanks. What we got? Looks like a lot mail back here in the back of the house.
The victim is a 49-year-old guy, and his name is Louis Krause. There is a large amount of blood around him, and he's been dead for some time.
The officers show Kenda why they think a burglar killed Louis.
When officers respond to a house, and when they see a window either open or, in this case, removed from the frame, their first instinct is burglary.
It very well could have been an unknown suspect who entered the house for the purpose of committing a burglary and confronted someone in the home and then killed him in that process.
The open window isn't the only sign of a possible burglary.
Lieutenant, we have his wallet. Where'd you find it? Pants pocket.
There's no money in this wallet. No currency, no paper money. There is one nickel in the wallet.
The empty wallet is a potential indicator of a robbery, but the victim may have simply been out of cash. A quick check of the house should confirm or rule out the burglary theory.
Burglary is a crash and grab crime. It's get in and get out. When you come to a scene where someone says this is a burglary, your expectations are to find certain things. dressers turned over, drawers open, things scattered everywhere.
Doesn't appear to be anything missing.
None of that's true here. There's no ransacking, there's no theft from the interior, there's none of the things you normally find with a burglary. So, burglary? No.
With the robbery motive seemingly eliminated, Kenda hopes a closer examination of the body will provide some answers.
Louis is laying face down. He is naked from the waist up. There is a large amount of blood, and he's been dead for some time.
Next to Louis's lifeless body, Kenda makes a critical discovery.
When you look at his body, there are shoe prints in the blood. These are the footprints of our killer.
Make sure you get some good pictures of the footprints. It looks like there's a chunk missing out of that shoe.
Shoe prints in and by themselves are not unique. Obviously, athletic shoe companies make millions of pairs of shoes.
But these are no ordinary shoe prints.
There is damage on one part of the left shoe. If you can find a matching shoe to that print, then you can say that this is the shoe that made that print.
Once photo evidence of the shoe print has been collected, Kenda turns his attention to the victim and a possible cause of death.
Why don't you help me roll them over? We'll take a look. Okay.
He's been savagely beaten. There isn't any part of him we can see that hasn't been hit.
Looking at Louis's hands, it appears he tried to ward off his attacker before ultimately losing the battle and his life.
He's got a lot of defensive wounds too. Looks like he put up a fight.
Louis has bruised and bleeding knuckles. That damage usually occurs when it's skin and bone to skin and bone, meaning the face. He fought for his life, and he most likely inflicted some level of injury on the perpetrator.
Looks like his throat's been crushed.
He was punched or kicked in the throat. Is it possible they crushed his larynx and obstructed his airway?
If Louis's larynx was crushed, he likely would have suffocated to death. Kenda knows a surefire way to determine if that's the case.
There is an artifact of death called a petechial hemorrhage. There are small pinpoint marks of blood in the whites of the eyes. They are indicative of asphyxia.
Kenda finds the hallmark pattern of petechial hemorrhage in both of Louis's eyeballs.
So it says to me that the beating crushes his larynx and he can't breathe, and it kills him. I'm certainly not a doctor, but I've looked at a lot of dead people.
With the likely cause of death determined, Kenda focuses his attention on his most pressing question.
Who would have a personal motive to hurt him?
How you doing? I'm Detective Kenda.
Kenda speaks with Louis's boss, Renee Wheatley.
When he didn't show up today, that's why I got worried.
Did he work there for a long time?
Several years, yes.
He had worked for her for years. She admired him. He was a dedicated employee, never missed a day of work, and never missed a customer with a newspaper. So he was great, as far as she was concerned.
Can you tell me about him?
He'd been doing so good. I was really proud of him.
They described him as a loving son, and who was devastated by the loss of his mother. But he was, in fact, an only child, and kind of lost in a way, with no one left to take care of him.
Renee informs Kenda that Louis's mother died 3 years ago. His ears perk up when Renee mentions her by name.
Betty Krause.
Betty Krause, the councilwoman?
Yes,
Really?
yes.
Betty Krause was Louis's mother. She had served as a member of our city council for a number of years.
Betty was widely known in the community, was a mover and shaker, one of the first women to be elected to a city council of a major city. She was an impressive woman.
Louis's mother's local fame poses a unique problem.
Even though Betty had passed away, there were great numbers of people who were very loyal to her in her memory. and that they would put pressure on me and on the police department to answer their questions constantly.
No sooner has Kenda arrived at headquarters than that pressure begins to mount.
I was asked to come to briefings in the mayor's office, briefings to city council, one person after another calling me directly.
Yes, sir. We have all available resources working on it right now.
I mean, I understood it. They were showing a legitimate concern for their friend and their friend's dead son. But all they were really doing is interfering with my investigation.
As the heat from City Hall starts to crank up, the case takes a bizarre turn.
Kenda.
Lieutenant, this is Dr. Rizzo over here at the coroner's office.
The coroner reports Louis Krause died of asphyxiation, as Kenda expected. But the next thing out of the coroner's mouth comes as a complete surprise.
During the course of the autopsy, it was determined that he, in fact, was wearing women's underwear at the time of his death.
The doctor was quite shocked when he discovered these ladies' panties. It's not a common thing.
The coroner's finding makes Kenda wonder if there's more to Louis Krause and his murder than meets the eye.
To be a homicide detective, you need an undying sense of curiosity. He's wearing ladies' underwear. There may be other secrets about his life. We've already found one, and if there's one, there's generally more than one.
Lt.Joe Kenda is investigating the brutal murder of newspaper delivery man Louis Krause. But Louis wasn't your average paper boy. He was the mentally challenged son of powerful former city councilwoman Betty Krause, which forces Kenda and his team to work under an intense spotlight.
When I discover he is related to a local heroine, I didn't feel very good about this case. When you deal with someone who is a member of a prominent family, it ratchets up the intensity of interest on the part of the general public as well as the press.
Further complicating matters, the coroner's office has just discovered a piece of evidence that suggests to Kenda that the victim was leading some sort of double life.
He wears women's underwear. When you discover in the course of any murder investigation some sort of bizarre or unusual behavior on the part of the victim, that would certainly lead you to conclude that there may be other secrets about his life that we don't know.
Wondering if something in Louis' lifestyle somehow got him killed, Kenda sends a pair of detectives back to Louis' neighborhood to learn more about him.
We, of course, talk to everyone that lives around Louis. No one knows him very well.
The neighbors say Louis mostly kept to himself, although there was one thing they had noticed.
Neighbors said that Louis had numerous people coming and going from his residence.
This is a middle-class, quiet neighborhood filled with long-term residents, most of whom were very distressed about the people they would see coming and going out of Louis' house.
What's more, many of Louis' visitors appeared to be less than upstanding citizens.
Some of them were couples, some of them were single people, some of them had criminal pasts, some of them were just down on their luck or whatever.
But who are these people? None of the neighbors can say. In search of a concrete lead, Kenda reaches out to someone who would have known Louis much better.
When Louis' mother died, she had made arrangements through the bank to provide a trust fund for Louis' care to the day of his death.
Hi, Jane.
Hi, Louis. How are you?
Good, thanks.
It's always good to see you. Come on in.
Louis' account was managed by a trust officer named Jane Wilson.
She becomes a very important witness to tell us about Louis as a person. She was responsible to kind of manage Louis' finances and kind of keep an eye on him at the request of the trust. She did her job very well, and she paid close attention to Louis.
Okay, all right. Well, I'll see you next Friday, okay?
Thank you.
All right.
She knows him pretty well.
Hi.
Detective Kenda.
Hi, nice
This is
to meet
Detective
you.
Flynn.
As Louis' financial caretaker, Jane was well aware of the rogues gallery of house guests her client entertained.
After his mother Betty passed away, I was a little bit concerned about some of the company that he kept.
According to Jane, Louis met lots of odd characters while working his job.
Well, he had a paper route that was from midnight till 5 a.m., so he didn't come across the best people.
We know that Louis was a special needs guy. He would meet people on the street when he was delivering his papers. Out of a sense of kindness or loneliness, he would invite them to stay with him, and they didn't have to pay rent.
So these people were actually living with him?
They would live with him in exchange for work around the house. I don't think he ever actually did any work around the house, but I think that was his expectation.
Jane Wilson tells Kenda that more often than not, Louis's house guests abused his generosity.
She felt that because of his disability, he was an easy target to be taken advantage of.
Dishes up?
No thanks, I shouldn't smoke those. They're bad for me.
You're a weird one, buddy.
You got that right. You gotta get it.
They're staying in his house. They're taking his money. They're riding around in his car. Maybe his circumstances, his diminished mental capacity is such that he can't judge when someone's taking advantage of him. But he often got in disputes with them and accused them of stealing money from him.
But despite their freeloading, Louis refused to part company with his questionable friends, which forced Jane Wilson to go to extremes in order to protect Louis's finances.
Ready for your money this week?
Yes, please.
Yeah?
She restricted how much cash she gave him at any one time. She was concerned that if she provided to him in too large of quantities, somehow these street people that he seemed to befriend would wind up with the money.
Since Jane Wilson seems to know Louis as well as anybody, Kenda goes out on a limb.
When the coroner did the autopsy, Louis was wearing a pair of women's pink underwear. Do you know anything about that?
He was a cross-dresser.
So he was a transvestite.
Okay. Was he homosexual? No. He wasn't homosexual. He was just a transvestite. He would deliver his newspapers dressed as a woman.
Could Louis's alternative lifestyle have drawn the ire of one of his house guests?
Do you know anyone we might want to talk to that could have information that might help us out?
No, I wish I had more information. I don't.
With nothing but a group of anonymous, unidentified suspects to work with, the investigation is stuck in first gear.
Okay, well, thank you very much.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
But on his way back to headquarters,
Go ahead for Kenda.
Kenda gets word from one of his men, who's tracked down a promising lead.
A co-worker of Louis gives us a guy whose name is Jerry Baca, a guy who has threatened Louis in the past.
According to the co-worker, Jerry Baca was a frequent guest at Louis's house. But the relationship soured one day, when Jerry discovered Louis's penchant for wearing women's clothes.
This is my room, homo! Oh, wait, no! Hey, I've been sleeping here this whole time!
He tells a guy that he believes Louis is a homosexual, and if he ever gets the chance, he's gonna kill him.
Kenda begins to wonder if the murder of Louis Krause is actually a hate crime.
Hate crimes and the motivations behind hate crimes are based on stupidity and misunderstanding. What if he just makes the decision that Louis is the kind of person who doesn't need to be in this world?
If that's the case, then an investigation already fraught with political tension just got even dicier.
So now the question becomes, is this a passion crime, rage crime, or is it fear? We need to find somebody right now.
While working his latest homicide case, Lt.Joe Kenda has discovered that his victim, Louis Krause, son of legendary local politician Betty Krause, had a habit of inviting drifters and other ne'er-do-wells into his home. He's also learned that Louis had another, equally unusual pastime.
He's a transvestite. He would dress in women's clothes.
Kenda now believes that one of Louis's former house guests murdered him after learning of his alternative lifestyle. The prime suspect, a drifter named Jerry Baca.
Baca said that he would kill Louis if he got the chance, because he hates homosexuals, and he believed Louis was homosexual. He's not just on the short list, he's at the top of the list.
But tracking down Jerry Baca won't be easy.
people like Jerry Baca. These are people who live on the street. They don't pay taxes. They don't have a job. Their social security number is not active anywhere. They're not in a database. They don't know what a database is. So it's very, very difficult to find them in the first place.
To get to Jerry, Kenda and his team are forced to hit the streets.
So you have to revert to the oldest kind of police work. You listen to the jungle drums. You start talking to your informants, who are other street people.
Hey, you know Jerry Baca?
Jerry who?
All right, man. Thanks.
Eventually, they hit pay dirt.
Hey, Beezy! How you been, my man?
Hey, what's up?
All right. You know Jerry Baca?
Man, yeah, I know him.
Indian guy?
Yeah.
You seen him lately?
Man, not since we were together in the camp.
Any idea where I can find him, where he hangs out?
Somebody was telling me that he had checked up with some girl.
This guy knew he lived with a girl in an apartment complex.
Yes, can I help you?
Man, we're looking for Jerry Baca.
I don't know Jerry Baca.
We know he lives here. Thanks. Jerry! I've been looking all over for you, man.
Baca is surprised and frightened that the police have arrived. He's even more so when we tell him that we're there because he made threats against a guy that's been murdered.
Get up, come on.
Detectives haul Jerry Baca down to the station, where Kenda is waiting for him.
Can I get you anything? Coffee?
You can tell me why I'm here.
Why don't you tell me about your relationship with Louis Krause?
You could see it in his face like, uh-oh, they're gonna accuse me of this.
There's no relationship. This is some dude, some
He says in no uncertain terms that he hates homosexuals, and he believed Louis was homosexual.
You don't like him enough to maybe want to hurt him, kill him, get in a fight with him?
I don't really care what they do as long as they stay out of my business.
You gay, Jerry?
I ask him, do you have homosexual tendencies? And he comes unstuck.
Now look, I'm not some
He really gets angry. So my thought is, well, I've touched a nerve there, haven't I, Jerry?
Did you ever threaten to kill him?
people threaten that's normal.
Kenda peppers an agitated Jerry Baca with questions about the death threats he made toward Louis Krause. But the more Jerry talks, the more Kenda realizes he's got the wrong guy.
He admits making these threats, but it was obvious to me that Baca was just running his mouth to his friends, and he wasn't serious about it.
Kenda has also taken note of a key detail in Jerry Baca's appearance.
Let me see your hands. Turn around.
He has no injuries at all on his face or his hands. Nothing. Not so much as a scratch. That's good for him, bad for us.
All right, you're free to go.
Do I think he's involved? No, I don't. Do I think he's a very confused fellow? Yeah, I think he is.
With Jerry Baca crossed off the list, Kenda decides to delve deeper into the double life that Louis Krause appeared to be leading. He has his detectives reach out to other members of Colorado Springs' small transvestite scene, but they don't drum up any new leads. Broadening his search, Kenda starts the painstaking process of identifying the rest of Louis Krause's former house guests.
We need to find all these amorphous people immediately. It's very difficult to do. So you just begin.
It's hard to track down those people. But what we try to do is to find out who you can determine was with him most recently, and then work from there.
You have to put pressure on the informants. You better find this guy for me or I'm not going to give any more money. On and on.
Slowly but surely, Kenda and his team compile a list of names and begin tracking them down.
We are talking with everyone who'd lived with Louis for any period of time in the last year.
But with each interview, Kenda's list of suspects grows shorter.
Most of them can account for where they were, but none of them are hurt. And nobody could be in a fight like that and not be hurt.
Though nearly all of Louis' former house guests are ruled out, their interviews were far from fruitless. When detectives asked them who might have killed Louis, a common thread emerged.
Some of the people that we contacted mentioned that an individual named Vernon Marshall was living with Louis Krause.
Vernon Marshall is a 35-year-old black male with some type of skin condition causing his hair to be falling out in his head.
Vernon claimed his unusual hair loss was caused by exposure to napalm during a tour of duty in Vietnam.
He told his friends he was from New York City. He told other friends he was from Chicago. Vernon had a story about a lot of things, but he never had a consistent story about anything.
Kenda's sources describe Vernon as a truly frightening character.
He was the kind of guy that if you got in a minor argument with him over anything, over nothing, he would not let it go. He would continue to argue about the same thing into the next day.
Despite Vernon's bad temper, he and Louis had been fast friends. Not only had Louis welcomed Vernon into his home, he had helped him find work.
It's like a game. I try to see how close I can get it. Watch.
Vernon's only source of income was working with Louis, delivering papers.
Where's your next house at?
Right here.
All right.
And would occasionally get a paycheck from the circulation department of the newspaper.
But according to Kenda's sources, Vernon was taking advantage of his friend's generosity.
We heard from those who knew Louis that he thought Vernon had taken some of his money, and he was very angry and upset over that.
Louis Krause was going to ask Vernon Marshall to leave, but he wanted to stay at Louis Krause's residence.
You took my money, Vernon. You took my money, Vernon, and I don't think I want you here anymore.
I'm not going back on the street.
You have to go!
What if Louis orders him out and it becomes mutual combat?
You have to go!
They begin to fight each other over one's eviction, and it goes too far. At certain points in investigations, you can feel it. I would start looking at that name and looking at the picture and saying to myself, Vernon, you and I are going to be talking about this.
Ever since Louis Krause was found beaten to death, friends of his politically prominent mother, Betty, have been pressuring Lt.Joe Kenda to solve the case. Kenda has sorted through a seemingly endless list of suspects before landing on one name, Vernon Marshall, friend and former house guest of Louis'.
He's a transient type person. He knew a lot of the same people that Louis knew.
You've got a guy identified, you know his name, you don't know where he is, and you think if I could just get my hands on this guy, that would be helpful. Well, agonizing about that isn't going to do us any good. We just continue to maneuver. You continue to work. The harder you work, the luckier you get.
Kenda decides to turn the huge public interest in the case to his advantage, calling in the local news.
There are many occasions when I've used the press. They, of course, would love to use me to improve their ratings by giving them information. Fine, I'll give you some. I'll give you some that might result in some return that I find to be useful.
Right now we have a person of interest.
Kenda provides them with a description of Vernon and information on his last known whereabouts.
If you do come across him, make sure you call our department immediately. That's all we have for now.
Thank you.
That evening, local news outlets run a story on Louis Krause's murder, featuring Kenda's detailed profile of his top suspect.
Right now we have a person of interest that we're looking for. His name's Vernon Marshall.
We're going to tell the public this information. It may generate a phone call. It might generate a lead.
The next day, the Colorado Springs Police Department is flooded with calls. None of them prove to be helpful until someone calls in with a dramatic new lead.
The Colorado Springs Police Department received a telephone call from Leslie and Tammy Firkins.
I remember I came home and I turned on the news and it showed that Louis Krause had been killed and that they were looking for Vernon. When I saw it on the news, I was like, oh my God.
Tammy had good reason to be alarmed. She'd seen Vernon in person less than 48 hours ago.
So let's go over to the Firkins house and see what they have to say.
Why don't you have a seat?
Thank you.
They're a young couple. They're in their 20s. They want to be helpful.
So how do you guys know Vernon Marshall?
We actually worked together at the Gazette.
My husband got a job at Gazette Telegraph, which was the local newspaper, and he worked as a press cleaner, where he had to clean all the ink off the presses.
He was a pretty good guy at first.
He started getting really moody.
He was on probation for drugs. I think he lost his job, and his wife left him.
It's been a rough couple years on him, no doubt about that.
According to the Firkinses, Vernon was prone to sudden bursts of anger.
My dog just didn't like him. When Vernon come over, he would growl, and I always believe that if your dog doesn't like somebody, there's a reason for it.
It was during this time that Louis Krause offered Vernon a place to stay while he got back on his feet.
So what led you to call the office? What precipitated that phone call?
He called us last night and said that he needed to take a trip to Chicago.
Vernon called us in the evening, and he'd asked, hey, can you come take me to the bus station? I got a bus that goes to Chicago tonight around 9. It was raining that night. My husband Leslie went to pick him up.
By the time Leslie rolled up to Louis's house, the rain was coming down in buckets, so Leslie honked his horn to let Vernon know he was outside.
When Vernon did come out, he was carrying 2 suitcases with him.
Hey man, you need a hand?
No, I was getting wet. I got it.
All right.
Did you drive him right to the bus station?
No, we came back here for a little bit.
Vernon had some time to kill before catching the bus, so Leslie brought him back to their place.
Hey guys, how are you doing? Oh, you look soaking wet. Here, keep this.
According to Tammy, when she handed Vernon a towel, she couldn't help but notice his injuries.
He had swollen cheek, black eye, all the things that would look like he had been beaten up.
And I asked him, what happened to you?
Oh my God, are you okay?
Yeah, I got in a fight. A couple guys tried to jump me and take my money, but I fought them off.
That looks really bad.
He said, I got jumped last night in the park by a couple of guys. They were after my money, but they didn't get it. I fought back, and I was able to escape.
Why don't you go to the bathroom and clean up?
All right, thank you.
Yeah, just out the hallway, first one on the right.
Okay, thank you.
And he went in the bathroom, cleaned up, and I told my husband, those marks are too fresh to have happened on last night. Something's wrong. But what do? Call the police and say, I think my friend did something? You can't really do anything at that point.
So it was muddy out?
Oh yeah.
I said, okay, show me where he walked in the mud. So we go in the yard.
Kenda leans down to take a closer look at the patch of mud near the front corner of the driveway. In doing so, he makes a startling discovery.
There are footprints in the mud, and there is damage on one part of the left shoe. They're the same sole pattern as the pattern we see at the crime scene in the victim's blood. We call the lab out there to photograph and make plaster casts of those footprints.
In order to lift the shoe print, you spray hairspray on the soil, you let the hairspray dry, and then you pour plaster Paris on it and let the plaster Paris set up, and then you just lift the shoe print from the soil.
At the crime lab, technicians compare the shoe print from the Ferkinsons' yard to the one found at the crime scene.
We have matching shoe prints, worn by Vern. And we know that Vern is at the crime scene within an hour of the time of death. And Vern is hurt. That adds up to a warrant for first-degree murder.
Kenda may have a warrant for his prime suspect, but by now, that suspect is long gone. Kenda and his team hope to pick up Vernon's trail at the bus station.
Excuse me, ma'am. Do you know who I would talk to about the bus schedules?
Oh, that'd be me, but I'm on my break.
Fantastic. Detective Kenda, is it possible you could tell me what buses went out tonight?
Yeah, we had one for, let's see, Vegas, Denver, and another one for Chicago.
The only bus that hasn't arrived anywhere is the one due in Chicago the following morning. So if he's on that Chicago bus, we can find him on it.
But is Vernon Marshall really on that bus? To answer that question, Kenda knows there's just one thing to do: make a beeline for the Windy City.
You like being in the shadows? Let's bring you out here in the light, where everyone can see you.
Lt.Joe Kenda is on the hunt for a drifter named Vernon Marshall, believed to have killed a politically connected but mentally challenged local man named Louis Krause. Vernon told friends he was taking a bus to Chicago. To catch him, Kenda is hoping that Vernon follows through.
When you're trying to track down a suspect, you can't automatically assume that he's going to carry out the plan that he may tell other people. It's very possible that they may change their mind, they may get off the bus, and at that point we could lose track of them.
The bus in question is set to arrive in Chicago later that day. Gambling that Vernon's still on it, Kenda calls in a favor from Chicago PD.
When you contact another police department and explain to them that Vernon Marshall is wanted for first-degree murder, the assumption is clear that he is potentially armed and he certainly is dangerous. After you've killed once, after that it's just numbers.
When the bus pulls into the station, a heavily armed team of Chicago's finest is there to greet it. Passengers begin slowly filing off. Finally, out steps Vernon Marshall.
Vernon Marshall! Turn around, face the bus. You're under arrest for the murder of Louis Krause.
The Chicago PD immediately called me from the bus station. We got your guy. Cool. Glad you do.
Kenda and one of his lead detectives hop the next plane bound for the Windy City.
When we first get there, it's 18 words worth of information. You called, we looked, we found. That's him, right in there. Thank you. They don't know anything about this case and they don't want to know. They have their own cases to work.
Kenda sifts through the personal effects officer sees during Vernon's arrest, but he doesn't find what he's after.
We knew he left Colorado Springs with 2 suitcases, and we felt very strongly that those suitcases probably had crucial evidence to our case.
We talked to the 2 detectives. We say, hey, when he went to the bus station, he had 2 suitcases. Did you recover those? And they said, we didn't even think about that.
Kenda races back to the bus station in hopes that one of the employees noticed Vernon's bags.
Excuse me.
Yes, can I help you?
You had a bus come in from Colorado Springs this morning?
Yes.
I'm here to see if you got a couple pieces of unclaimed luggage that might have been on it.
Let me check that for you.
Thanks.
When the clerk picks up the blue one, he recoils.
She says, boy, this one really stinks. Yeah, it does.
It's an odor Kenda knows all too well.
Whatever is in there is blood-soaked. And because it's contained and not exposed to the air, the blood is decomposing, it's putrefying, producing this unique smell. So the bus guy says, do you want me to open that one? No, I don't.
Recognize that, Vernon?
Don't open it.
He looked at us and just kind of shook his head. Oh, you don't want to look at that. Really? Well, what do you suppose is in there, Vernon? We find Vernon's clothing soaked in blood. We find the shoes with the same print pattern that's seen at the crime scene, and they're covered in blood as well.
These about your size?
If you're going to kill somebody, it's probably not a good idea to take all the evidence with you and have it with you when I find you.
My life is over now.
My detective looks at him and says, it'll be all right. He blurts out, how can it be all right? He's dead and I killed him. Well, that works for me, Vernon, and it'll work for a jury as well.
Kenda and his team now have enough evidence to piece together what happened. It started when Louis Krause began to suspect his old pal Vernon Marshall had been stealing money from him.
The day of the homicide, Louis Krause had planned to confront Vernon Marshall and ask him to leave his residence.
You took my money, Vernon. You took my money, Vernon, and I don't think I want you here anymore.
I'm not going back on the street.
Vernon had no place to go. As Louis pressed him to either hand over the stolen cash or leave, Vernon's dangerous temper boiled to the surface.
Did Vernon just lose it and start wailing on Louis? Yeah, he did. Louis defended himself, he tried to. But Vernon kept beating on him until he didn't move anymore.
He tried to clean up the scene, but because of the amount of blood, that was just an impossible task.
Vernon emptied Louis's wallet. It'd be enough to get him to Chicago. He then asked his friends Tammy and Leslie Firkins for a ride to the bus station.
When we assess everything that happened, Vernon and Louis got into a conflict over a relatively small amount of money. And it's that conflict and those circumstances that caused Louis's death.
On May 16, 1986, Vernon Marshall pleads guilty to second-degree murder and is sentenced to 16 years in prison. City officials are pleased to see justice served for the son of their beloved former colleague.
They certainly expressed their gratitude to the Colorado Springs Police Department for their work in this case.
However, that's not why Lieutenant Kenda remembers Louis Krause.
Louis Krause died because he didn't have the capacity to understand his fellow men. He didn't understand when people would take advantage of him. Someone did, and ultimately took his life.
The desert keeps secrets better than people do, and on a cold Nevada morning in 2005, it swallowed a young woman without leaving a scream behind, without a struggle carved into the dirt, without anything that could be called an answer. 1 minute she was there, headlights fading down a 2-lane highway, the radio murmuring through static. The next minute, she was gone, as if the night itself had decided to erase her. No blood. No body. No goodbye. Just a stretch of asphalt baking under the sun by day, and freezing under the stars by night, holding its breath. It happened on the outskirts of a town that barely made the map, a place where everyone knew everyone, where nothing dramatic ever stayed secret for long, except this. She was 24, newly settled, recently hopeful, the kind of person who still believed moving west meant starting over. Friends would later say she loved open spaces, the way the desert looked endless and forgiving at the same time. That belief would become cruelly ironic. On the night she vanished, she had left work later than usual. A minor delay. An ordinary inconvenience. The kind of thing no one remembers until it becomes the last confirmed moment. Her car was found the next morning, parked crookedly on the shoulder of State Route 50, hazard lights dead, driver's door unlocked. Inside, everything looked normal in the most unsettling way. Purse on the passenger seat. Phone gone. No signs of a crash. No skid marks. No footprints leading into the desert. It was as if she had simply stepped out of her life and never stepped back in. When the call came into the sheriff's office, it sounded routine. Possible breakdown. Welfare check. Another lonely car on a lonely road. By sunset, it was a missing person case. By the end of the week, it was something else entirely. The first responders remember the silence. Wind pushing against the car. Heat radiating off the metal even in the early hours. A half-empty coffee cup in the console, still smelling faintly of sugar and cream. They walked the perimeter, scanning for anything out of place, and found nothing except the feeling that something was wrong in a way they couldn't name. The desert had been disturbed, but not enough to tell a story. No drag marks. No shell casings. No broken glass. Just space. Too much space. Her name spread through town faster than any official press release. Flyers went up on diner doors, gas station windows, school bulletin boards. A smiling photo, slightly overexposed, the kind people use when they don't expect it to become a symbol of loss. Candlelight vigils formed without planning. People stood together in parking lots, holding flames against the wind, whispering theories they didn't want to say out loud. Someone suggested she ran away. Someone else said she would never do that. Someone mentioned a truck seen late that night. Someone else remembered hearing nothing at all. Investigators worked the case hard in those first weeks, because that's when hope still feels practical. They canvassed the highway, knocked on doors miles apart, questioned co-workers, friends, ex-boyfriends. They searched the desert on foot, then on horseback, then with helicopters cutting slow circles through the sky. Cadaver dogs traced faint, frustrating paths that dissolved into nothing. Each day ended with less certainty than the day before. Each night brought the same question, hanging unanswered in the dark. How does someone disappear without a sound? Rumors crept in where facts failed. A drifter passing through. A serial offender who knew the back roads. A secret life no one had noticed. The town absorbed each idea, turned it over, rejected it, then reached for another. The sheriff held press conferences that offered reassurance without substance. No evidence of foul play, he said at first, then later, we are not ruling anything out. The words changed, but the meaning didn't. They had nothing solid. Nothing they could build on. Her family arrived from out of state, stunned by the vastness of the place where she had vanished. They walked the shoulder of the road themselves, staring out at scrub and rock, trying to imagine where she might have gone. Her mother kept asking the same question, over and over, as if repetition might force an answer into existence. Why would she leave her car? Why here? Why at all? No one could explain it without speculating, and speculation felt like another kind of violence. As days turned into weeks, the case began to cool in the quiet, inevitable way that unsolved disappearances do. Leads dried up. Tips contradicted each other. Sightings placed her hundreds of miles away, then right back where she started, then nowhere at all. Investigators followed each one until it collapsed under scrutiny. The car yielded no usable prints. The highway cameras were outdated, grainy, blind in all the wrong places. Technology failed. Witnesses misremembered. Time slipped through their hands. By the end of the year, the phrase cold case started to appear in internal memos, though no one said it out loud yet. Cold cases sound final. They sound like surrender. Officially, the investigation remained open, but resources moved elsewhere, to crimes with bodies, to problems that left clearer evidence. Her file thickened, then gathered dust. New detectives read it, shook their heads, and put it back. The desert kept waiting. The community changed around the absence. People stopped leaving their doors unlocked. Parents warned teenagers about late drives. The road where her car was found gained a reputation, whispered about as cursed, unlucky, wrong. Truckers avoided stopping there at night. Locals drove faster through that stretch, eyes fixed ahead. Her name became shorthand for fear, for unfinished business. Remember what happened, people would say, without needing to say more. Years passed. New faces moved into town, who didn't know her story until someone told it in a low voice. Her family aged. Birthdays came and went, marked by silence. Each anniversary brought a brief flare of attention, a newspaper article, a local news segment with the same old photo and the same unanswered questions. Detectives retired. Files were boxed up, then unboxed, then boxed again. Nothing changed, except the weight of time pressing down on everything. And yet, the case never fully died. Every so often, something small would stir it. A bone fragment found in the desert, later identified as animal. A confession from a man in another state, quickly disproven. A new forensic technique that promised answers, but delivered none. Each time, hope rose just enough to make its eventual collapse hurt all over again. The disappearance remained stubbornly incomplete, a story without a middle or an end. By the early 2010s, the phrase Nevada 2005 disappearance had become a fixture in true crime forums, discussed by strangers who dissected every known detail, every photograph, every mile marker. They built timelines, mapped theories, argued over probabilities. Some believed she was taken by someone she knew. Others insisted it was a random crime of opportunity. A few claimed she staged her own disappearance perfectly. None of them could prove anything. The case absorbed their attention and gave nothing back. For the town, the mystery settled into the background like a constant hum. It was always there, felt more than heard. The desert still looked the same. The road still stretched on, indifferent. But the absence had carved a permanent space in the collective memory, a reminder that not all stories resolve, that some simply linger, unresolved, demanding to be remembered. And somewhere between the silence of the open land and the unanswered questions piling up in a forgotten file, the truth waited, unseen, untouched, as the years continued to pass. The case didn't freeze all at once, it congealed slowly, like oil thickening in winter, each unanswered question adding weight, until movement itself became difficult. And in the years after her disappearance, the investigation shifted from urgency to endurance, from chasing shadows to guarding a flame that refused to go out. Detectives rotated in and out, each bringing fresh eyes and leaving with the same frustration, reading the same transcripts, staring at the same photos, tracing the same timeline, that always ended at that crookedly parked car on State Route 50. They learned her habits the way one learns a stranger's routine from receipts and phone logs, piecing together a life from fragments, trying to hear a voice through paperwork. They reconstructed the night again and again. Her shift ended late. She called a friend briefly, nothing urgent, nothing strange. The phone pinged off a tower miles from where the car was found, then went silent. No outgoing calls. No voicemail left behind. Investigators argued over minutes, over miles, over whether she stopped voluntarily or was forced, whether the car had been moved or had always been right there. The desert offered no timestamps, no witnesses willing to swear to what they saw in the dark. One detective became obsessed with the idea of a second vehicle. It made sense. Someone stops to help. Someone flags her down. Someone she trusts, or someone who looks harmless enough in the glow of headlights. He tracked down every tow truck operator, every delivery driver, every long-haul trucker, who had passed through that stretch of road that night. Most had nothing. A few had stories that fell apart under scrutiny. One man remembered seeing a car pulled over, another remembered nothing at all. Memory proved unreliable, especially when asked to stretch back months, then years. Another investigator focused on the car itself, treating it less like an object and more like a witness that refused to speak. He sent samples to labs, hoping new technology might find what old methods missed. Fibers. Trace DNA. Anything. The results came back clean, or contaminated, or inconclusive. Too many hands had touched it in the early days, too many well-meaning people had leaned in, peered inside, tried to help. Evidence, once compromised, doesn't regenerate. It just sits there, inert, mocking the effort. As the investigation stalled, pressure came from outside. Her family pushed for answers, for action, for anything that felt like progress. They hired a private investigator, who promised results and delivered theories instead. They paid psychics, who spoke in riddles and left them emptier than before. They wrote letters to state officials, to federal agencies, asking for resources, asking for attention. Sometimes they got meetings. Sometimes they got polite condolences. Mostly, they got silence. The town absorbed the years in its own way. Businesses changed hands. Schools renovated. New roads were built. But that stretch of highway remained the same, a thin scar across the landscape, and locals never forgot what it represented. Teenagers grew up hearing the story like a cautionary tale, a reminder that danger didn't always announce itself loudly. Parents still glanced at the clock when loved ones drove late at night. The disappearance became part of the place's identity, woven into its collective sense of vulnerability. Every few years, the case flickered back into the light. An anonymous tip called in from another state, claiming knowledge of a burial site. Search teams assembled, scanned the coordinates, dug into the earth, and found nothing. A convicted offender bragged in a cell, hinting at involvement, then recanted when confronted. Each false lead left behind a residue of disappointment, a fatigue that settled into the bones of everyone still paying attention. Hope, stretched too thin, begins to fray. By the mid-2010s, technology advanced faster than the case itself. Databases grew. Algorithms improved. Cold cases across the country found new life through genetic genealogy, through digitized records, through connections that had been impossible before. Her file was revisited yet again, scanned, uploaded, cross-referenced. Detectives ran her name through national systems, linked her timeline with others, searched for patterns. Similar disappearances. Similar roads. Similar ages. The overlaps were tantalizing, but never definitive. Patterns suggest, they don't prove. One theory refused to die, that someone in the town knew more than they were saying. Not a stranger passing through, not a phantom on the highway, but a familiar face hiding behind normalcy. Investigators re-interviewed people they had spoken to years earlier, now older, sometimes less guarded, sometimes more. Stories shifted in small ways. A detail added here. A contradiction there. Nothing big enough to act on, but enough to raise eyebrows. Guilt doesn't always look like guilt. Sometimes it looks like impatience, like defensiveness, like forgetting something that should be unforgettable. Her social circle was dissected repeatedly. Friends. Co-workers. Former partners. Anyone who had argued with her, disappointed her, depended on her. Alibis were checked and rechecked. Most held. Some were fuzzy but unbreakable without new information. Time is an ally to lies. It smooths them, reinforces them, gives them the weight of repetition. By the time investigators returned, years later, many alibis had become accepted truths, difficult to challenge without fresh evidence. The desert itself became a suspect in the public imagination, a vast accomplice that could hide anything forever. Searchers returned to it with better tools, better maps, better aerial imaging. They found old campsites, abandoned mines, forgotten debris. They found bones that turned out to be animal, or human, but unrelated, remnants of other stories, other losses. Each discovery stirred headlines, then quieted. The desert never gave up what it was holding, if it was holding anything at all. Online, the case took on a second life. Armchair detectives argued fiercely, constructing elaborate scenarios from sparse facts. Some accused specific individuals, naming names, drawing connections that law enforcement couldn't acknowledge. Others warned against speculation, against turning real people into villains without proof. The debate grew heated, then cyclical, repeating itself every anniversary, every new rumor. For her family, it was a double-edged sword. Attention meant remembrance, but also meant strangers rewriting her life and death in comment sections. Law enforcement faced its own internal battles. Limited budgets. Competing priorities. Younger officers who had never known the early days of the case, who inherited it as an unsolved file rather than a living crisis. Some felt drawn to it, compelled by its stubbornness. Others saw it as a dead end, a sinkhole for time and resources. Leadership changed. Strategies shifted. The case remained, waiting for the one detail that could tip it forward. Then came a moment, small at first, almost easy to miss. A routine audit of evidence storage turned up an item long thought lost. A piece of material collected near the car, dismissed years earlier as irrelevant. At the time, testing options had been limited. Now, it was run through modern analysis, more out of thoroughness than expectation. The results were not conclusive, but they were not nothing. They suggested contact. They suggested presence. They suggested that someone else had been closer than anyone realized. The finding didn't solve the case. It didn't name a suspect. But it changed the temperature. Detectives leaned in again, this time with renewed focus. They revisited old interviews with new questions in mind. They re-examined timelines, looking for overlap they had previously overlooked. They quietly requested assistance from agencies with more advanced resources, careful not to promise anything they couldn't deliver. For the first time in years, movement felt possible. Still, progress was fragile. Every step forward risked collapsing under scrutiny. Evidence degraded. Memories blurred. Witnesses died or moved away. The margin for error shrank with every passing year. Investigators knew that if there was an answer, it existed in the narrow space between what had been preserved and what had been lost forever. They worked within that space, cautiously, methodically, aware that one wrong assumption could derail everything. For the community, nothing seemed to change. The road was still there. The desert still stretched out, silent and immense. But beneath the surface, beneath the familiar story of an unsolved disappearance, something shifted. The case was no longer entirely dormant. It breathed, faintly, as if stirred by an unseen hand. And though no one said it out loud, the possibility hung in the air, unsettling and electric. After all these years, the truth might not be as unreachable as it once seemed. What changed the rhythm of the case wasn't a confession, or a dramatic arrest. It was something quieter, more dangerous in its subtlety. A question no one had asked the right way before. When detectives reopened the evidence logs and timelines with that small, newly significant detail in mind, they stopped looking at the disappearance as a single moment and started treating it as a sequence, the chain of decisions and opportunities that stretched further back than the night she vanished. The focus shifted from what happened on the shoulder of the highway to what was already in motion long before her car ever slowed down. They began with her final weeks, combing through them with an almost forensic intimacy. Bank records, work schedules, emails saved on old servers, text messages recovered from backup systems that hadn't existed when the case began. Patterns emerged, not dramatic ones, but subtle deviations from routine. A different gas station. A missed lunch she normally never skipped. A short exchange with a number not saved in her phone, the content mundane, but the timing curious. None of it screamed danger, but together it suggested distraction, pressure, something nudging her off her usual path. Detectives interviewed co-workers again, this time less interested in alibis and more interested in mood. Had she seemed stressed? Distracted? Afraid? Most said no, then paused, then added qualifiers. Maybe tired. Maybe preoccupied. Maybe excited about something she hadn't shared yet. One colleague remembered her glancing at her phone more often than usual during breaks. Another recalled a hushed conversation, cut short, when someone walked into the room. At the time, no one thought twice about it. In hindsight, everything felt heavier. The unknown phone number became a focal point. It had pinged off a tower not far from the highway earlier that week, then disappeared from her records entirely. Investigators traced it as far as they could, through outdated carriers and recycled accounts, hitting walls that had only grown thicker with time. The number belonged to a prepaid phone, activated briefly, then discarded. Common. Anonymous. Perfect for someone who didn't want a trail. It wasn't proof, but it was intent, and intent mattered. As they dug deeper, they found themselves circling back to people who had always been on the periphery of the case, close enough to notice, but not close enough to accuse. One name, mentioned early and then dismissed, resurfaced with uncomfortable consistency. He wasn't a stranger, but he wasn't family. Not a lover, not exactly a friend. Someone who moved through her life easily, without drawing attention. Someone who knew her schedule, her routes, her habits. Someone who had offered help before. In 2005, his interview had been unremarkable. Calm. Cooperative. He placed himself nowhere near the highway that night. His alibi relied on routine, on normalcy. He had gone home. He had gone to sleep. No witnesses contradicted him. There was nothing to push back against. Now, years later, detectives listened to the recording again, not for what he said, but for how he said it. The pauses. The deflections. The way he answered questions that hadn't been asked yet. It wasn't evidence, but it was discomfort. They called him back in under the guise of a routine follow-up, careful not to trigger defenses too early. Time had changed him. Age had softened his appearance, but hardened his demeanor. He seemed surprised to see them, then quickly annoyed. He repeated his story with minor differences, the kind that come from memory decay, or from rehearsal, it was impossible to tell. He laughed at one point, a short, sharp sound that didn't fit the moment. When asked about the prepaid phone, he shrugged. Said lots of people used those back then. He wasn't wrong. Behind the scenes, investigators worked parallel angles. They ran his name through updated databases, cross-referencing it with incidents that hadn't existed in 2005. Complaints. Civil disputes. A restraining order filed years later, quietly settled. Nothing directly violent, nothing that screamed predator, but a pattern of boundary violations, of people feeling unsettled and unable to articulate why. These were the kinds of details that rarely make headlines, but matter deeply to those who collect them. The desert searches resumed, this time guided by analysis rather than hope. Old mining maps were digitized. Ground-penetrating radar swept areas previously written off as too vast to search effectively. Volunteers were kept at a distance. This phase was controlled, deliberate, precise. They weren't looking for closure yet. They were looking for corroboration, for anything that could anchor suspicion to geography. The land resisted them, as it always had, offering up rocks and bones that belonged to other eras, other stories. As whispers of renewed activity spread, the community reacted with a mix of skepticism and fear. They had been here before. Promises had been made before. Each new development reopened wounds people had learned to live with. Her family was notified cautiously, told only that the case was active again, that new information was being evaluated. They tried not to hope. Hope had betrayed them too many times. Still, they listened more closely to the news, read between lines, waited for a call that might finally say something different. The suspect, if that's what he was becoming, noticed the change too. Friends reported him asking questions about the investigation, about whether old cases ever really got solved. He joked about true crime obsession, about how people saw patterns where none existed. Humor can be a shield, but it can also be a leak. Investigators noted the timing of his curiosity, the way it spiked as pressure increased. Awareness is not guilt, but fear of discovery has its own gravity. A breakthrough came not from the desert or the phone records, but from a forgotten storage unit tied to the suspect, leased years earlier and abandoned. Inside were boxes of old belongings, most of them mundane, the kind of clutter people accumulate and forget. But one item stood out, preserved in plastic, out of place among the rest. It wasn't definitive. It wasn't labeled. It was simply wrong, wrong enough to warrant testing. The lab results took weeks, stretching patience thin. When they came back, they didn't provide an answer, but they narrowed the field. The findings suggested proximity. Not a smoking gun, not a headline-worthy revelation, but something that hadn't existed before. A tangible link between the suspect and the disappearance that couldn't be explained away easily. Investigators built around it carefully, knowing how fragile cold cases are, how easily they collapse under aggressive moves. They needed more. They needed context, corroboration, motive that could stand up to scrutiny. They revisited the idea of opportunity, mapping the suspect's movements with as much precision as the years allowed. Credit card records, employment logs, gas receipts. Small gaps appeared, moments unaccounted for, stretches of time that could be nothing or could be everything. In 2005, those gaps would have gone unnoticed. Now, they glowed. Investigators don't need certainty to keep digging. They need plausibility, and they had it. As pressure mounted, so did the silence. The suspect declined further interviews. His attorney intervened, issuing statements about harassment and speculation. Online, rumors exploded, names were whispered, then shouted. Law enforcement refused to confirm or deny anything, sticking to carefully worded assurances. The phrase, active investigation, returned to official vocabulary, carrying weight it hadn't carried in years. For the family, the waiting became unbearable in a new way. This wasn't the numb waiting of the unknown. This was sharp, electrified, filled with implications they didn't want to voice. They wondered whether knowing would hurt more than not knowing, whether answers could ever be enough after so long. They visited the highway again, stood where the car had been found, imagined a version of events that finally had a face, a shape. It didn't bring peace. It brought clarity edged with anger. As winter approached, detectives prepared for the possibility that this was as close as they would get without something breaking. Confessions are rare in cases like this. Evidence ages. Witnesses disappear. What remains is pressure, applied steadily, patiently, until something gives. They waited for mistakes, for slips, for the human inability to maintain perfect composure forever. And beneath it all, the story that had once seemed frozen in time was moving again, inch by inch, driven not by certainty, but by accumulation, by the slow, relentless narrowing of possibilities. The desert still held its secrets, but the circle around them was tightening, and for the first time in nearly 2 decades, the silence felt less like an ending and more like the pause before something finally breaks. Pressure doesn't announce itself loudly in cases like this, it seeps in, settles into routines, turns ordinary moments into tests, and by the time the suspect realized the investigation had narrowed its focus, the weight of it was already altering the air around him. Detectives didn't rush. They knew better. Cold cases aren't won with dramatic confrontations, they are won with patience, with the slow accumulation of inevitability. Every move was calculated to look incidental, almost accidental, while quietly tightening the perimeter. They started by talking to people who hadn't mattered before. Old neighbors. Former co-workers of the suspect. Acquaintances who had brushed past him in social settings and thought nothing of it at the time. These weren't hostile interviews, just conversations, framed as part of a broad review. Most people were eager to help, flattered to be asked, surprised to find themselves thinking back nearly 20 years. Memories surfaced reluctantly, blurred but persistent. A temper here. An odd comment there. Nothing criminal on its own, but enough to build texture, to replace the flat outline of a man with something more dimensional. One woman remembered an argument, not violent, just sharp, the kind that leaves a mark without leaving evidence. She recalled the way he had stood too close, lowered his voice, smiled when she stopped pushing back. At the time, she had written it off as awkwardness. Now, retelling it, she felt foolish for ignoring the instinct that had told her something was wrong. Another recalled him knowing details he shouldn't have known, schedules he hadn't been told, information that suggested attention bordering on fixation. Again, not proof, but pattern. Investigators mapped these recollections against the timeline, looking for resonance, for echoes of the same behavior repeated in different contexts. Obsession doesn't usually appear all at once. It builds, feeds on proximity, thrives on access. The theory taking shape wasn't one of random violence, but of escalation, of a line crossed after many smaller ones had gone unnoticed or unchallenged. It reframed the disappearance not as an anomaly, but as an outcome. Behind closed doors, the task force debated strategy. They had a person of interest, not a suspect they could name publicly. They had circumstantial links, behavioral red flags, and a growing sense of coherence, but still no body, no crime scene, no moment they could point to and say, this is where it happened. Prosecutors were cautious. Juries don't convict on vibes and timelines alone. Everything hinged on whether they could force the story out into the open without tipping their hand too soon. Surveillance began quietly. Nothing invasive, nothing dramatic. Just watching. Documenting routines. Noting deviations. The suspect adjusted quickly, or maybe he had always been careful. He changed routes. Avoided familiar places. Spoke less, smiled less. Friends noticed the tension creeping into his demeanor, the way he seemed perpetually on edge. He complained about being watched, about paranoia gripping the country, about how easy it was for innocent people to get caught up in investigations. It sounded rehearsed, as if he were practicing lines for an audience he hadn't met yet. The prepaid phone resurfaced in unexpected ways. Through old retail records and partially recovered transaction logs, analysts traced a cluster of similar phones purchased in the same region within a narrow window of time. Most led nowhere. One intersected with a name tied loosely to the suspect, a friend of a friend connection that might have been coincidence, might not. When confronted with the information in a casual setting, the suspect dismissed it instantly, too instantly, as if the answer had been waiting. That response went into the file, highlighted, cross-referenced. The desert searches yielded nothing dramatic, but they did refine assumptions. Certain areas were ruled out definitively, others elevated in probability. Investigators learned to read the land differently, understanding where someone unfamiliar would wander, and where someone knowledgeable would go directly. Old access roads, forgotten pull-offs, places invisible to passers-by, but obvious to locals. The absence of evidence began to feel less like failure and more like intention. Media interest flared again as leaks, subtle and unconfirmed, found their way to reporters hungry for a breakthrough narrative. Headlines danced around words like renewed investigation and person of interest, careful not to overstep. The public reacted with a familiar mix of excitement and dread. Online forums lit up. Amateur sleuths reanalyzed photos, timelines, names. Some landed uncomfortably close to the truth. Others veered wildly off course. Law enforcement monitored it all, aware that public pressure could force mistakes on both sides. Her family was brought in for a closed-door briefing, the most detailed they had received in years. Detectives spoke carefully, choosing language that acknowledged progress without promising resolution. They explained the focus on one individual, the reason for caution, the reality of legal thresholds. It was both a relief and a new kind of torment. For the first time, the disappearance had a shape that wasn't abstract. It had a possible face. That made it harder to sleep. The suspect's circle began to shrink. Invitations dried up. Conversations ended awkwardly. People sensed the gravity around him even if they didn't know its source. Isolation can do strange things to a person. It removes mirrors, eliminates feedback, leaves only internal dialogue. Investigators hoped that under that pressure, something would slip. A comment. A call. A movement they could exploit. They waited. Then came the near miss, the moment that almost broke the case wide open. A witness came forward claiming to have seen the suspect's vehicle near the highway that night, years ago, a memory triggered by recent coverage. The details were compelling. The timing aligned. Investigators followed the lead aggressively, verifying as much as they could. But memory is a treacherous thing, especially after years of reinforcement by stories and images. Under deeper questioning, inconsistencies emerged. The sighting couldn't be corroborated. It collapsed, leaving behind only frustration and a renewed awareness of how fragile progress was. Still, the attempt mattered. It rattled the suspect. He contacted an attorney again, this time more urgently. He deleted social media accounts. He stopped answering calls from certain people. In one intercepted conversation, legally obtained, he was heard asking a friend whether old things ever really stay buried. It was a rhetorical question, but it hung in the air like a confession waiting to happen. Investigators replayed it over and over, parsing tone, context, subtext. Internally, the task force prepared for two possible futures, one where a breakthrough arrived suddenly, unexpectedly, and one where it never came at all. Cold cases often hover on that edge, balanced between resolution and permanent ambiguity. They documented everything meticulously, aware that even if this generation couldn't close the case, the next might stand on their work and see something they couldn't. As months passed, the investigation entered a delicate phase. Too much pressure risked spooking the suspect into silence or flight. Too little risked letting the trail go cold again. The balance required restraint, discipline, and a willingness to accept incremental progress as victory enough for now. Detectives learned to live with uncertainty, to work without the satisfaction of closure. The community watched, waited, speculated. Some believed justice was finally coming. Others warned against optimism, reminding everyone how many times hope had been raised and dashed before. The disappearance had taught them skepticism. It had taught them that answers don't always arrive cleanly, or at all. And through it all, the road remained unchanged, stretching through the desert as it always had, indifferent to human urgency. Cars still passed through at night, headlights cutting brief tunnels of light through the darkness. Most drivers never thought about the woman who vanished there, never felt the weight of history beneath their tires. But for those who knew, for those who had followed every turn of the case, the highway was no longer just a road. It was a question, still unanswered, humming quietly in the background as the investigation edged closer to whatever truth it could finally reach. By the time winter gave way to a muted spring, the investigation had entered its most dangerous phase, the one where confidence can become complacency and silence can be mistaken for victory. Detectives knew they were close to something, not close enough to touch, but close enough to feel the heat of it, and that sensation sharpened every decision. They slowed down deliberately, forcing themselves to recheck assumptions, to question the narrative they were building before it hardened into bias. Cold cases don't forgive arrogance. They punish it. The suspect maintained his distance, legally and emotionally. Through his attorney, he declined further contact. On paper, that was his right. In practice, it drew a clean line where there had once been gray. Investigators respected the boundary while working around it, turning their attention to the spaces he couldn't control, his past, his patterns, the quiet ripple effects of his behavior on others. They began reconstructing his life the way they had reconstructed hers, looking for intersections that had once seemed insignificant. A former co-worker came forward after weeks of hesitation, spurred less by media coverage than by guilt. He described a conversation from years earlier, a late-night exchange over drinks where the suspect had spoken about the desert with unsettling intimacy. Not admiration. Ownership. He had talked about how easy it was to disappear there, how the land erased mistakes, how nothing stayed buried unless you wanted it to be found. At the time, it had sounded like drunken philosophizing. Now, retold under fluorescent lights, it landed differently. Investigators pressed gently, aware of how easily memory can be reshaped by suggestion. They asked for specifics. Dates. Context. The co-worker struggled, then produced an old calendar, a relic from before everything lived in the cloud. The date circled in pen aligned uncomfortably close to the disappearance. It wasn't proof, but it was corroboration of a mindset, and that mattered more than people realize. Crimes often begin as ideas long before they become actions. The prepaid phone angle resurfaced again, this time through a different channel. A retired clerk from a now-defunct convenience store recognized a photo shown during a follow-up canvass. He remembered selling several identical phones in quick succession to the same man, paid in cash, quiet, impatient. He couldn't swear it was the suspect, not after all these years, but he remembered the urgency, the way the man had asked which phones couldn't be traced, the way he'd left without a receipt. The clerk's uncertainty limited the statement's power, but the behavior described fit too neatly to ignore. Meanwhile, forensic analysts revisited the item recovered from the storage unit, applying methods that hadn't been available even a few years earlier. Results came back layered, complex, cautious in their language. They couldn't place it at the scene definitively. They couldn't date its contact precisely. What they could say was that it didn't belong where it had been found, and that its presence suggested a connection more personal than incidental. In a newer case, it might have been enough. In this one, it was another brick, added carefully to a wall still missing its keystone. Prosecutors sat in on strategy meetings more frequently now, their questions sharp, their skepticism necessary. How do you tell a jury a story that begins in 2005 and still feels alive? How do you prove a crime without a body, without a location, without a moment of violence captured in evidence? The answer, everyone knew, was coherence. A story that made sense not because it was dramatic, but because it was consistent, because every piece pointed in the same direction without contradiction. To that end, investigators sought motive not in rage or greed, but in entitlement. The theory crystallized slowly. A man who believed access meant ownership, who mistook proximity for permission, who escalated when control slipped out of reach. The disappearance, in this framework, wasn't impulsive. It was the final act in a progression. That idea explained the planning, the absence of evidence, the clean break. It didn't need violence to be loud. It needed it to be effective. Surveillance picked up subtle changes. The suspect stopped driving certain routes. He avoided the desert entirely, choosing longer, less direct paths. When asked casually by an acquaintance why he no longer went out there, he brushed it off with a joke about getting older, about preferring civilization. The deflection was noted. People don't usually explain habits no one has questioned unless they feel the need to. Tension leaked into his personal relationships. A friend described him as hollowed out, present but distracted, conversations looping back to the same themes, fear of false accusations, anger at media, resentment toward people who couldn't let the past go. Projection is a familiar companion to guilt, but it's not exclusive to it. Investigators resisted the urge to read too much into it, even as they documented every word. Then came the search warrant request, the most delicate move yet. It wasn't sweeping. It didn't demand access to everything. It targeted a narrow window, a specific location tied to new information that had been quietly developed. The judge approved it after careful review, the language precise, the scope limited. Law enforcement executed it without spectacle, without sirens, without press. They found items both ordinary and unsettling, artifacts of a life lived alongside a secret no one else could see. Among them was a map, old, creased, annotated in pencil. At first glance, it meant nothing. Just routes, landmarks, notes. But analysts noticed something off about the markings, the way certain areas were emphasized, revisited, circled. When cross-referenced with search history, with old GPS data recovered from obsolete devices, a pattern emerged. The map wasn't about travel. It was about avoidance, about knowing where not to be seen. The discovery electrified the task force, but they tempered their reaction. They had been close before. They had been wrong before. Everything was run through layers of verification, through independent review. Analysts were asked to challenge conclusions, to find alternative explanations. Some did. Some couldn't. The balance began to tip. Her family was informed again, this time with heavier words, with longer pauses between sentences. Detectives explained that they were nearing a critical decision point, that charges were possible, but not guaranteed, that the absence of a body remained the greatest obstacle. They answered questions honestly, even when the answers hurt. The family listened, hands clenched, absorbing the weight of hope and fear intertwining once more. Publicly, nothing changed. Official statements remained cautious. The phrase, ongoing investigation, continued to do its quiet work. But behind the scenes, timelines were being finalized, witness lists refined, narratives tested and retested. The case that had once seemed impossibly thin now had mass, gravity. It pulled everything toward it. The suspect sensed the shift. His behavior tightened further. He began documenting his own movements obsessively, keeping records no one had asked for. He spoke about moving away, about starting over somewhere no one knew his name. When friends pushed back, he accused them of betrayal. Isolation deepened. Pressure does what pressure always does. It exposes fault lines. And still, there was no confession. No dramatic breakdown. Just a man retreating into himself as the walls closed in, and a group of investigators holding steady, resisting the urge to force an ending before it was ready. They understood something essential. This wasn't just about closing a case. It was about closing a wound that had been left open for nearly 2 decades. The desert waited, unchanged, unbothered by human timelines. Somewhere within its vastness, it either held the final truth, or it didn't. The investigation had reached the point where only 2 things could resolve it: an undeniable piece of evidence, or a human decision to stop carrying a secret alone. Everything else had already been exhausted. As spring turned warmer and the anniversary of the disappearance approached once again, the town braced itself. People felt it in small ways, in restless nights, in conversations that trailed off when certain topics arose. Something was coming. They didn't know what. They didn't know when. But after all these years, the silence no longer felt empty. It felt full, stretched tight, like the final seconds before a sound finally breaks through. The anniversary arrived quietly, without ceremony, without cameras lining the highway the way they once had, but everyone who had lived with the case felt it all the same, a low-pressure system settling over the town, thickening the air. 19 years since the night she vanished. 19 years of questions aging without answers. Detectives marked the date on their calendars not out of sentiment, but because anniversaries do something to people. They loosen tongues. They sharpen guilt. They remind those who know more than they've said that time is not erasing anything, only watching. Inside the task force, the focus narrowed further. This was no longer about whether the suspect fit the theory. It was about whether the theory could survive contact with a courtroom. Every assumption was stripped down, every inference challenged. They ran mock trials behind closed doors, playing the role of skeptical jurors, hostile defense attorneys, judges intolerant of speculation. Where would the story bend? Where would it break? They learned quickly where the weak points were, and none of them were small. No body. No confirmed crime scene. No eyewitness to violence. These absences loomed over everything like a warning. Cold cases without bodies are built on inevitability, not certainty, and inevitability is harder to sell. Prosecutors reminded them of that constantly. You don't ask a jury to believe what might have happened. You show them what couldn't not have happened. To do that, investigators returned once more to the night itself, combing through it with almost ritualistic discipline. They rebuilt the timeline minute by minute, layering old data with new interpretation. Traffic patterns. Weather reports. Moon phase. Visibility. What could be seen from where? What couldn't? The desert at night is deceptive. It feels empty, but it carries sound. It swallows light. It gives cover to anyone who understands it. The suspect did. A breakthrough came from an unexpected place, an old emergency services log, partially digitized years earlier, but never fully analyzed. It recorded a brief, ambiguous call that night, flagged as accidental, disconnected before details were given. At the time, it had been lost among dozens of similar non-events. Now, when investigators cross-referenced its location with cell tower pings and estimated travel times, it landed disturbingly close to where her phone last registered movement. The call wasn't proof of a crime, but it was proof of panic, proof of interruption. Audio technicians enhanced the degraded recording, isolating background noise. Wind. Static. And beneath it, something else. A voice, possibly female, too faint to identify, cut off mid-syllable. No words could be recovered. Just the sense of urgency, the abrupt silence. When detectives played it in the briefing room, no one spoke for a long moment. This was as close as the case had ever come to hearing her in real time, suspended between presence and absence. The suspect was brought back into focus with renewed intensity. Investigators requested another interview, knowing it would likely be refused. It was. His attorney issued a carefully worded statement expressing concern about harassment and reiterating his client's cooperation in the past. The tone was defensive now, less dismissive than before. Prosecutors took note. Defense posture changes are rarely accidental. Behind the scenes, financial analysts uncovered something small but telling. A cash withdrawal made by the suspect the day after the disappearance, larger than his usual pattern, made at an ATM miles from his normal routes. Cash leaves no trail, but deviations leave questions. When paired with the prepaid phones, the storage unit, the map, it began to look less like coincidence and more like choreography. The task force debated arrest without charges, a pressure tactic sometimes used to provoke mistakes. Prosecutors advised against it. Too risky. Too visible. If the suspect felt cornered too quickly, he might retreat completely, or worse, destroy something that still existed, something they didn't even know they needed yet. Patience remained the strategy, even as frustration mounted. Then, finally, something cracked, not loudly, not cleanly, but enough. A woman contacted investigators through a tip line late one evening, her voice unsteady, her story halting. She had known the suspect years ago, casually, briefly. She hadn't thought about him in a long time. But after seeing renewed coverage, after hearing rumors she couldn't quite ignore, a memory resurfaced that refused to stay quiet. She described a night shortly after the disappearance, when he had shown up unannounced, agitated, asking for help he couldn't specify. He had wanted to store something, just for a while. She had refused. He had left angry, muttering about people not understanding what it meant to be loyal. Investigators listened carefully, asked measured questions, careful not to contaminate the memory. She provided dates. They matched. She described his demeanor. It matched other accounts. She couldn't say what he wanted to store, couldn't say where he went afterward, but she remembered the fear, the sense that she had narrowly avoided becoming part of something irreversible. Fear, like guilt, leaves an imprint that time doesn't fully erase. Her statement alone wouldn't carry a case. But when layered over everything else, it changed the calculus. It suggested urgency. It suggested aftermath. It suggested that the disappearance had not ended cleanly, that there had been loose ends, panic, improvisation. Crimes planned in theory often unravel in practice. People make mistakes. They seek help. They reveal themselves. Prosecutors reviewed the new information overnight. By morning, the tone shifted. Not confident. Not celebratory. Determined. They authorized preparation for a grand jury presentation, the quiet step that precedes public action. Subpoenas were drafted. Witnesses were prepped. The story was refined one final time, stripped of flourish, reduced to its most brutal simplicity. Someone stopped on that road. Someone left that car. Someone never came back. And the absence that followed was not an accident. When word reached the family, it came through a call they had both hoped for and dreaded. Detectives didn't promise justice. They didn't promise certainty. They said only that the case was moving into a new phase, one that would finally ask others to decide what investigators had carried alone for years. The family cried, not out of relief, but out of exhaustion. Hope, once revived, hurt differently than before. The suspect learned of the grand jury indirectly, through whispers, through the tightening behavior of those around him. He withdrew further, cancelled plans, packed boxes he didn't label. Surveillance noted the activity, the restlessness, the late nights. On one occasion, he drove out toward the desert again, stopping short of the old highway, sitting in his car for nearly an hour before turning back. Investigators watched from a distance, unsure whether they were witnessing nostalgia, regret, or calculation. The desert, indifferent as ever, offered no commentary. It had seen men come and go, secrets buried and unearthed, truth lost and found. It would outlast this too. But the human story unfolding around it was reaching a point of no return. As the grand jury date approached, the town felt the tension ripple outward. Conversations stalled. Rumors sharpened. People who had lived beside the mystery for nearly 2 decades sensed the shape of an ending forming, even if they didn't yet know what it would look like. Some feared it. Some welcomed it. Some doubted it would ever truly come. And in the quiet moments between preparation and action, investigators allowed themselves a dangerous thought, one they had avoided for years, that they might finally be close enough for the truth to stop hiding. Not because the desert had given it up, but because the people who carried it no longer could. The grand jury proceedings unfolded behind closed doors, as they always do, quiet and procedural, stripped of drama, but the weight they carried was immense. This was where years of fragments would either fuse into something solid or scatter for good. Investigators presented their case carefully, methodically, resisting the temptation to oversell. They knew better than anyone how fragile this was. Each witness spoke not in absolutes, but in accumulation, describing behaviors, moments, intersections that by themselves meant little, but together formed a shape that was becoming harder to ignore. They walked the jurors through the timeline slowly, starting not with the disappearance, but with the days leading up to it. The prepaid phones. The subtle shifts in routine. The map. The storage unit. The emergency call cut short. The woman who refused to store something she was never meant to see. Each piece was placed deliberately, like evidence pins on a board, connected not by emotion but by logic. This wasn't about outrage. It was about inevitability. Jurors asked questions. Sharp ones. Why no body? Why no eyewitness? Why now? Prosecutors answered without flinching. Cold cases don't wait for permission to age, they said. Evidence doesn't improve with time, but perspective does. Technology changes. People change. And sometimes, silence becomes louder than denial. They reminded the jury that disappearance itself can be evidence, when every alternative explanation collapses under its own weight. Outside the courthouse, nothing appeared different. No press conferences. No flashing lights. But inside the task force, nerves ran high. Detectives checked their phones obsessively, replayed testimony in their heads, wondered which detail might have landed and which might have missed. Years of restraint made this waiting feel unbearable. Action had become a habit. Waiting was torture. The suspect felt it too. Surveillance documented restless nights, erratic driving, phone calls made and deleted. He visited a relative he hadn't spoken to in years, stayed only minutes, left visibly agitated. He began giving away belongings, items of no great value but personal significance, as if shedding weight. When questioned casually by an acquaintance about rumors of renewed investigation, he snapped, his composure cracking just enough to show the strain underneath. Stress reveals what practice conceals. Then came the call. The grand jury had returned an indictment. Not for murder, not yet, but for charges that acknowledged what investigators had argued all along, that a crime had occurred, that the disappearance was not voluntary, that evidence existed to support the belief that she had been taken and that the suspect had played a central role. It was enough to move forward. Enough to step into the light. Arrest teams mobilized with controlled urgency. No sirens. No spectacle. They found him early in the morning, half-packed boxes lining the walls of his home, his phone face down on the table. He didn't resist. He didn't ask why. He asked how long they had been watching. When informed of the charges, his expression didn't shift to shock or outrage. It settled into something flatter, heavier. Recognition, perhaps. Or relief. The news broke fast once it broke at all. Headlines exploded across screens and front pages. Nevada 2005 disappearance cracked in 2023. The word cracked carried weight, even if the case was not yet solved in the way people expect. The community reacted in waves. Disbelief. Validation. Anger. A cautious, aching hope. For some, it felt like justice finally knocking. For others, it felt like reopening a wound they had learned to survive. Her family learned of the arrest through a direct call, not through the news. Detectives spoke plainly, acknowledging both progress and limitation. Tears came, then silence. They had waited nearly 2 decades for this moment, and it arrived without the clarity they had imagined. There was no body to bury. No final explanation. Just a confirmation that what they had always felt was real, she hadn't vanished by choice. The suspect's initial court appearance was brief, procedural. He stood quietly, eyes forward, hands clasped. When the judge read the charges, a murmur rippled through the courtroom. This was the man many had suspected, others had defended, most had never truly known. Cameras captured his face, now stripped of anonymity, frozen in a single frame that would follow him everywhere. Guilt and innocence would be debated later. For now, visibility itself was a consequence. Defense attorneys moved quickly, filing motions, challenging the narrative, attacking the lack of physical remains. They called the case circumstantial, speculative, built on inference and hindsight. They weren't wrong about the difficulty. But difficulty doesn't equal impossibility. Prosecutors prepared for a long fight, aware that every assumption would be challenged, every memory questioned, every motive dissected. Public opinion fractured instantly. Some hailed the arrest as overdue justice. Others warned against celebrating too soon, against mistaking closure for truth. Online debates reignited with ferocity. Old theories resurfaced. New ones formed. The case, once dormant, now pulsed with attention, every development magnified, every silence scrutinized. For investigators, there was no celebration. Just a shift in responsibility. The hunt was over. The proving had begun. They reviewed their work again, knowing the defense would do the same with far less generosity. They braced for attacks, for accusations of tunnel vision, of confirmation bias. They reminded themselves why they had waited so long, why they had moved so carefully. This moment was the result of restraint, not impulse. The desert, unchanged, watched it all from a distance. The road where her car had been found remained just a road, traveled daily by people who now glanced at it differently, aware that history had finally caught up to the present. Some stopped there for the first time, standing on the shoulder, imagining the night that had swallowed her whole. Others avoided it entirely, unwilling to feel that proximity. As the legal process ground forward, one question echoed louder than all the rest: would the truth ever fully emerge? An indictment is not an answer. An arrest is not a confession. And a conviction, if it came, would still leave gaps that only one person could fill. Investigators knew that. So did the family. So, perhaps, did the man now sitting alone in a cell, stripped of routine, stripped of control, forced to sit with memories he had managed for years. Pressure changes shape when the walls close in completely. There is no more distance to retreat into, no more normalcy to hide behind. Only time, and the unbearable weight of what remains unsaid. And somewhere in that narrowing space, between public reckoning and private truth, the case held its breath once again, waiting to see whether justice would stop at accountability, or push further, into the dark, where the final answer still lay buried. The weeks after the arrest moved at two speeds at once, glacial in the courtroom, frenetic everywhere else. Motions were filed, dates set, continuances requested. Legal language replaced investigative urgency, and the case that had lived in shadows for years now unfolded under fluorescent lights, dissected syllable by syllable. Outside, the town buzzed with a restless energy, as if everyone were holding the same breath, afraid to exhale too soon. Inside the jail, the suspect adjusted poorly to confinement. Routine stripped away illusion. There was no desert to retreat into, no long drives to clear his head, no casual conversations to steer away from dangerous topics. Just time. Time to remember. Time to replay. Time to calculate. Guards noted the changes first: sleeplessness, pacing, sudden stillness followed by bursts of agitation. He asked repeatedly about news coverage, about what people were saying, about whether his name was being dragged through the mud. Reputation, even now, mattered to him. Investigators watched closely, not because they expected a spontaneous confession, but because pressure has a way of bending people toward disclosure in unexpected forms. Jail calls were monitored. Visits were logged. Letters were read. Most contained nothing remarkable, just legal coordination and strained family reassurances. But every so often, a phrase stood out, a turn of language that hinted at something underneath, something unresolved. He spoke of being misunderstood, of mistakes, of how one decision could ruin everything. He never said her name. Prosecutors prepared for the preliminary hearing, knowing it would be the first real test of their case in open court. This wasn't about proving guilt beyond a reasonable doubt yet. It was about showing enough to move forward, enough to justify the years of quiet work that had led to this moment. They organized witnesses carefully, choosing credibility over drama, consistency over shock value. Cold cases don't win on spectacle. They win on accumulation. The defense strategy became clear early. They would attack the timeline, the memory of witnesses, the interpretation of evidence. They would frame the investigation as retroactive storytelling, a narrative built backward from a desired conclusion. They would lean heavily on the absence that still loomed largest: no body, no confirmed location of a crime. Reasonable doubt would be their North Star, and they would follow it relentlessly. When the hearing began, the courtroom filled with a subdued intensity. No shouting, no theatrics. Just a steady procession of testimony. A detective described the initial disappearance, the abandoned car, the silence of the desert. Another walked through the years of stalled progress, the technological advances, the reopening of leads once thought exhausted. Witnesses spoke of conversations, of behavior that had once seemed merely odd and now felt heavy with implication. The woman who had refused to store something testified quietly, her voice steady, but her hands trembling. The defense cross-examined with precision, probing memory gaps, suggesting contamination by media, implying coincidence where the prosecution saw pattern. It was effective. Jurors shifted in their seats. Doubt crept in, as it always does when certainty is impossible. Prosecutors expected this. They didn't fight it. They leaned into it, acknowledging uncertainty while arguing inevitability. People don't erase themselves this completely, they said. Not without help. The emergency call audio was played, brief and haunting. Wind. Static. A broken moment suspended in time. The courtroom went still. No one pretended it was definitive. But no one dismissed it either. It was a crack in the wall of silence, and everyone could feel it. Outside the courthouse, coverage intensified. Commentators debated the strength of the case, the ethics of charging without a body, the balance between justice and caution. Some accused law enforcement of overreach. Others accused them of waiting too long. The disappearance, once a local wound, had become a national conversation again, pulled into the broader fascination with unresolved crimes and delayed accountability. For the family, each day of testimony reopened old pain in new ways. They listened to strangers describe their daughter, their sister, as evidence, as context, as absence. They heard her life reduced to timestamps and phone records. It was necessary. It was brutal. They sat together, hands clasped, absorbing it all because this was the price of movement, the cost of finally being heard. Then came the moment investigators had quietly hoped for, but never expected to arrive so soon. During a routine review of seized materials, analysts discovered an anomaly in a digital device long considered irrelevant. The data was fragmented, corrupted, nearly unreadable. But within it was a cluster of deleted files, metadata suggesting access to locations far more remote than previously known, accessed repeatedly in the months following the disappearance. The timestamps were old. The coordinates imprecise. But the intent was unmistakable. Someone had been searching for isolation. The finding was immediately evaluated, triple-checked, challenged internally. When it held up, prosecutors moved fast but carefully, requesting a brief recess in proceedings to assess its impact. Defense attorneys objected, arguing surprise, demanding full disclosure. The judge granted limited time, balancing fairness with the gravity of the information. The courtroom buzzed with speculation during the pause. Something had shifted. Everyone could feel it. When proceedings resumed, the new evidence was introduced cautiously, framed not as a revelation, but as reinforcement. It didn't point to a body. It didn't point to a crime scene. It pointed to behavior, to preoccupation, to a mind mapping places where no one would look. The defense pushed back hard, suggesting curiosity, coincidence, benign interest in exploration. Prosecutors responded with pattern, with repetition, with timing. Exploration doesn't usually spike after someone disappears. The suspect sat motionless through it all, eyes fixed ahead. But those watching closely noticed the change, the tightening jaw, the slight shake in his hands. Pressure was no longer abstract. It had become personal, immediate. He conferred with his attorney more frequently now, whispers growing more urgent. Something was happening behind his eyes. The judge ruled that the case would proceed. Probable cause existed. The charges would stand. It wasn't a verdict. It wasn't closure. But it was a door opening, one that had been sealed for nearly 2 decades. The family exhaled for the first time in days, a fragile release that carried no celebration, only relief that the story was still moving forward. As the trial date was set months out, investigators returned to a familiar posture, waiting. But this waiting was different. It was no longer passive. Every development fed back into the case, sharpening it, testing it. They prepared for the possibility that the suspect might finally speak, might seek a deal, might try to control the narrative before it was taken from him completely. In jail, his behavior grew more erratic. He asked to speak with a chaplain, then cancelled. He requested legal texts, then ignored them. He wrote letters he never sent. Guards overheard him muttering at night, fragments of sentences that went nowhere. Regret? Fear? Calculation? No one could say. But something was unraveling. The town watched from a distance, unsure how to feel. Justice, delayed this long, didn't arrive cleanly. It stirred up old doubts alongside new hope. Some people avoided the news entirely, tired of reopening a story that had defined their sense of safety for so long. Others consumed every update, hungry for an ending that might finally make sense of the years in between. And still, the central question remained unanswered. Where was she? The indictment, the arrest, the hearings, none of it had brought her back, none of it had given the land a voice. The desert remained silent, vast and inscrutable, holding whatever it held with the same indifference it always had. As summer approached and the case edged closer to a full trial, investigators understood something with painful clarity. They were closer than they had ever been, and still impossibly far from the one thing that could truly end this story. The truth was no longer hidden. It was resisting. The summer heat arrived early that year, pressing down on the town like a held breath, and with it came the slow march toward trial, a countdown measured not in days, but in tension. Legal teams retreated into preparation, witness lists tightened, exhibits refined, language sharpened until every word carried intent. The case had moved beyond investigation and into interpretation, where truth and doubt would wrestle in public, and nothing would be taken for granted. Behind bars, the suspect's world narrowed further. The routines of incarceration flattened time, turning days into indistinguishable stretches of waiting punctuated by moments of panic. He asked fewer questions now. He listened more. When he spoke, it was often to test reactions, to float hypotheticals, to measure how much others knew. Investigators recognized the shift. This was not resignation. This was calculation under pressure. Then came the first real fracture. It happened during what was supposed to be a routine attorney-client meeting. Guards later reported raised voices, then silence, then a request for privacy beyond what protocol allowed. The request was denied. Minutes later, the suspect asked to see a prosecutor, not to negotiate formally, but to clarify some misunderstandings. The wording was careful. Non-committal. But it was enough to send a ripple through the task force. Prosecutors approached cautiously. They had seen this before, partial truths offered in exchange for leverage, information dangled to regain control. They agreed to listen, nothing more. No deals. No promises. Just ears. When they met, the suspect didn't confess. He didn't deny. He spoke in abstractions, about how situations spiral, about how people make choices that can't be undone. He framed himself as a witness to tragedy rather than its author. It was frustrating. It was revealing. He asked what would happen if someone helped fill in gaps. Prosecutors answered plainly, cooperation could matter, but only if it led to verifiable truth. Speculation and storytelling would change nothing. He nodded, as if confirming something to himself, then said nothing more. The meeting ended without resolution, but the shift was unmistakable. The wall had cracked. It just hadn't fallen. Within days, investigators noticed changes. He requested maps. Not generic ones, but detailed topographic charts. He asked about old mining claims, about land ownership records. When denied, he grew agitated, then withdrawn. He stopped calling certain people, started calling others. Patterns emerged, subtle but telling. Pressure was doing what pressure does best, narrowing options. At the same time, the defense team began to reposition. Motions multiplied, some aggressive, some strangely conciliatory. They floated the idea of a plea without formalizing it, testing the temperature. Prosecutors held firm. Without her location, without her remains, there would be no shortcuts. Accountability without truth wasn't enough. Not in a case like this. The family was informed, carefully, of these developments. Detectives explained the significance without inflating it, warned against reading too much into tentative movement. They had lived too long on the edge of possibility to trust it easily. Still, the knowledge that he was speaking, however indirectly, stirred something dangerous and hopeful. Answers felt closer now, close enough to hurt. Then the call came. Late at night, through counsel, the suspect requested another meeting, this time explicitly conditional. He would provide information. Not everything. Not yet. But something concrete. In return, he wanted assurance that what he said would be evaluated seriously, not dismissed as manipulation. Prosecutors agreed to listen again, setting strict parameters. No immunity. No promises. Just the chance to speak. This time, he was different. Less abstract. More precise. He spoke about the desert not as an idea, but as a place. He referenced landmarks investigators recognized, but had never publicized. He described distances in a way that suggested familiarity, beyond casual travel. He stopped short of naming what was there, or why, but the implication was unmistakable. He knew something. He had always known something. Investigators left the meeting shaken, not because they had heard a confession, but because the information he provided could be tested. And testing is where truth either collapses or hardens. Search teams were assembled quietly, deliberately. No press. No volunteers. Just specialists and equipment, moving with the efficiency of people who knew how much rested on this. The area described was remote even by desert standards, accessible only by unmarked paths, overlooked in previous searches, because it sat just outside assumed parameters. That oversight haunted investigators as they prepared. The desert greeted them with heat and silence, the same way it always had. They moved methodically, scanning, mapping, probing. Hours passed with nothing but rock and dust. Doubt crept in, familiar and corrosive. Had they been played? Had this been another deflection, another attempt to delay the inevitable? Then a technician stopped. The signal was faint, inconsistent, but it was there. An anomaly beneath the surface, not metal, not natural. Something disturbed long ago, settled just enough to blend in, but not enough to disappear entirely. Excavation began slowly, reverently. No one spoke. Shovels gave way to brushes. The sun climbed higher. What they found was not immediate closure. Not yet. But it was confirmation. Human remains, partial, degraded by time and environment, but unmistakable. The call back to headquarters was brief. Controlled. Emotional reactions were postponed, locked away for later. Procedures took over. Documentation. Preservation. Transport. The desert, after 19 years, had finally yielded something back. When the family was told, the words landed unevenly, heavy and unreal. There was grief, raw and immediate, but also a strange relief that cut through it. She had not vanished into nothing. She had been somewhere. She had been waiting to be found. They cried for what was lost, and for what had finally been returned. The suspect was informed the next morning. Observers noted the reaction, a long exhale, a slackening of posture, as if a burden he had carried privately had shifted into the open. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The desert had spoken for him. News broke within hours, despite efforts to contain it. Headlines shifted tone overnight. The word disappearance gave way to remains found. The community reacted with shock layered over old sorrow. Some felt vindicated. Others felt hollow. Finding her didn't undo the years. It only changed their shape. For investigators, the discovery transformed everything. The case was no longer about absence. It was about action. Forensic teams worked around the clock, extracting every possible answer from what remained, aware of the limitations time had imposed. They knew some questions would never be answered fully. But now, at last, they had a place, a fact, a truth that could not be argued away. As the sun set over the desert that evening, casting long shadows across the land that had hidden her for so long, the silence felt different. It was no longer defiant. It was spent. And with that silence broken, the case moved inexorably toward its final reckoning, carrying with it all the weight of 19 lost years, and the irreversible knowledge that the truth, once unearthed, cannot be buried again. The discovery changed the gravity of everything. What had once been argued as theory now carried the unmistakable weight of fact, and the legal machinery adjusted accordingly, grinding louder, faster, more relentlessly than before. Forensic teams worked with clinical precision, knowing time had already taken most of what it could, but also knowing that even fragments can speak if handled carefully enough. Bones were catalogued. Soil was analyzed. The environment itself became a witness, telling a story in erosion patterns, in placement, in what had been disturbed and what had been deliberately left untouched. The medical examiner was cautious, almost reverent, in their conclusions. The remains could not tell everything. Cause of death would be difficult, perhaps impossible, to determine definitively. But there were signs of trauma inconsistent with accident or exposure. Enough to rule out wandering. Enough to rule out choice. The language was careful, measured, devastating in its restraint. Homicide could not be excluded. In context, it didn't need to be said louder than that. Prosecutors amended the charges within days. The case that had once circled around absence now anchored itself in presence. The indictment grew heavier, more specific. Defense attorneys reacted with urgency, filing motions to suppress, to delay, to challenge the chain of discovery. They argued contamination, coincidence, overinterpretation. But the desert had already given up too much. This wasn't conjecture anymore. It was geography. It was placement. It was intent written into the land itself. The suspect was moved to a different facility for safety, isolation tightening around him like a second skin. Without the buffer of denial, his behavior shifted again. Guards reported long periods of stillness, followed by sudden requests to speak with counsel, then abrupt cancellations. He stopped asking about public opinion. He stopped asking about timelines. He started asking about sentencing. Prosecutors didn't rush him. They had learned patience the hard way. They allowed the weight of reality to do what confrontation never could. And it worked. The request came through quietly, late in the evening. He wanted to talk again. This time, without abstractions. This time, without hypotheticals. The room was small. The air stale. The recording equipment unobtrusive but unforgiving. When he entered, he looked smaller than before, diminished not by incarceration, but by inevitability. He sat down, stared at the table, and for a long moment said nothing. Silence, once his shield, now pressed in from all sides. He began haltingly, correcting himself mid-sentence, as if testing how much truth he could release without collapsing. He described the night in fragments. The stop on the highway. The conversation that escalated. The moment when control slipped. He avoided details that would force him to confront violence directly, but the outline was unmistakable. This had not been an accident. It had been an assertion of power, followed by panic. He spoke of the desert as solution, not symbol. A place he knew would not ask questions. He admitted to planning, though he framed it as preparation, just in case. He admitted to returning to the site more than once, checking, adjusting, ensuring permanence. Each admission landed with quiet finality, recorded, time-stamped, irreversible. When asked why he waited so long to speak, his answer was simple. Because silence worked. Because the world moved on. Because the desert kept what it was given. He hadn't expected technology to catch up. He hadn't expected people to keep caring. He hadn't expected the past to refuse burial. The confession was not complete in the way stories like to imagine. It left gaps. It skirted motive. It softened intent. But it aligned with evidence in ways that could not be faked. Locations matched. Timelines aligned. Details he could not have known unless he had been there slipped out unguarded. It was enough. When the family was told, there were no words that could contain the moment. They were given the option to hear parts of the statement, or to wait until trial. They chose distance. Knowing where she had been was enough for now. Hearing how would come later, if at all. Grief does not demand completeness. It demands honesty. News of the confession broke with seismic force. The tone of coverage shifted again, from speculation to reckoning. Headlines dropped their cautious verbs and replaced them with certainty. The town reacted not with celebration, but with a collective, exhausted sorrow. Justice, when it finally arrives, rarely feels triumphant. It feels heavy. It asks to be carried. The defense pivoted one last time, preparing for damage control rather than denial. Negotiations began in earnest, the possibility of a plea emerging not as mercy, but as acknowledgement. Prosecutors weighed the cost of trial against the value of sparing the family further pain. The decision was not simple. Accountability matters. So does finality. In the end, the choice was made quietly. A plea agreement, detailed, unambiguous, requiring full acknowledgement of responsibility and the disclosure of everything he knew. No theatrics. No public bargaining. Just an ending shaped by reality rather than spectacle. The court accepted the plea weeks later. The judge spoke at length, not just about the crime, but about the years it had stolen, the ripples it had sent through a community that would never quite be the same. The sentence reflected that weight, measured not only in years, but in permanence. There would be no early exit from this story for him. When the family addressed the court, their words were steady, restrained. They spoke of who she had been, not how she had died. They spoke of absence, of birthdays and holidays marked by silence. They did not offer forgiveness. They did not need to. Truth had finally been spoken aloud. That, in itself, was something they had waited a lifetime to hear. As proceedings ended, the case that had once been labeled unsolvable finally closed on paper. Files were archived. Evidence logged for the last time. Investigators cleared their desks of a weight they had carried for years, some longer than they had ever admitted. Closure did not bring relief so much as release. The work was done. The story had an ending, even if it wasn't the one anyone would have chosen. Outside, the desert stretched on, unchanged, indifferent to human conclusions. But it no longer held this particular secret. That burden had been lifted, transferred back to the world of people, where it belonged. And as the town slowly learned how to live without the question that had haunted it for so long, one truth settled in with quiet certainty: time can hide many things, but it does not erase them. It only waits. And eventually, it demands to be answered. After the courtroom emptied and the microphones were turned off, what remained was not resolution, but residue. Justice, once delivered, does not evaporate. It settles into the walls, into the streets, into the quiet routines that try to resume as if nothing fundamental has shifted. The town returned to its habits slowly, cautiously, aware that something essential had been altered beneath the surface. The case was over, but its imprint was permanent. Her name, once spoken only in whispers or half-finished sentences, now appeared in full again. On documents. On memorial notices. On the lips of people who had been children when she vanished and were now adults grappling with the realization that the mystery they grew up with had been hiding a truth far darker than rumor. Some felt relief. Others felt betrayed by how long it had taken. Most felt both at once. The family faced a different reckoning. They were no longer searching, no longer waiting for a phone call that might change everything. Instead, they learned how to live with certainty, a task far more difficult than anyone admits. Certainty removes hope, but it also removes doubt, and in that vacuum, grief expands to fill the space. They buried what could be buried. They marked a place where memory could rest, even if answers never fully would. Investigators moved on to new cases, but not entirely. Cold cases leave fingerprints on the people who carry them, shaping how they see every disappearance, every unanswered call, every file that goes quiet too soon. This one lingered. It reminded them that patience is not passive, that time can be an ally if it is handled with discipline, and that silence, no matter how complete it seems, is rarely absolute. The suspect, now a convicted man, disappeared into the system he had once believed he could outwait. His world contracted to concrete and schedules, to rules he could not bend and nights he could not escape. He gave no more interviews. He answered no more questions. The story, which had once belonged to him in secret, no longer did. It belonged to the record now, immutable and public, stripped of ambiguity. Occasionally, a journalist would return to the town, chasing the afterimage of the case, hoping to find something unresolved, something still burning. They found quieter things instead. A roadside now marked by flowers that were replaced year after year. A diner where people still remembered the night her face first appeared on the television screen. A stretch of desert that locals avoided, not out of superstition, but respect. Places remember, even when people try not to. The case entered textbooks and training seminars, cited as an example of what persistence looks like when it refuses spectacle. It became a reminder that breakthroughs are often born not from genius, but from refusal to discard a file, to dismiss a family, to accept that disappearance equals erasure. Young investigators learned her name before they ever worked a case of their own, absorbing the lesson without fully understanding its cost. And yet, for all the analysis and documentation, something remained untamed. The emotional echo of 19 years could not be archived. It lived on in moments that arrived without warning. A song on the radio, a car pulled to the side of a road, a late-night knock that triggered a spike of adrenaline long after it was needed. Trauma does not obey timelines. It revisits when it chooses. The desert, unchanged and eternal, absorbed none of this. It offered no apology, no explanation. It had kept a secret, because it had been asked to, and when the pressure grew too great, it released what it held. Not out of mercy. Not out of justice. Simply because even the most silent places cannot carry everything forever. In the years that followed, the case was referred to as solved, a word that felt both accurate and insufficient. Solved implies completion, a neat alignment of question and answer. This was something else. This was an ending that closed a door without reopening the years trapped behind it. The mystery was gone. The damage was not. Still, something important had been reclaimed. The truth had been spoken aloud, not as rumor or speculation, but as fact. The story had been taken out of the shadows and returned to the world, where it could be remembered correctly. Where her life would not be defined solely by how it ended, but by the persistence of those who refused to let it vanish without explanation. And so the case faded from headlines, from trending lists, from the relentless churn of attention that moves on to fresher tragedies. But it did not disappear. It settled into memory, into cautionary tales, into the quiet understanding that some questions wait decades for their answers, and some answers arrive too late to heal, but just in time to matter. Because the past does not stay buried simply because it is hidden well. Because silence is not the same as absence. And because every unanswered disappearance leaves a shadow that stretches far beyond the moment someone goes missing, following communities, families, and time itself, until the truth finally decides it can no longer remain unseen. This one waited 19 years. And when it surfaced, it changed everything.